Welcome to You Can't Say That in Court, a podcast by Rise Women's Legal Center. I'm Vicky Law.
And I'm Stephanie Melnick. We are your hosts in this conversation about survivors of violence navigating the BC family law system. We recognize that this system is colonial and causes harm to families, and that disproportionately impacts Indigenous people.
By speaking more widely about these harms, we hope to raise awareness about the challenges that survivors face as they navigate the colonial family law system. This podcast is our attempt to collectively identify the barriers and ask for positive changes to be made. Thank you for joining us. Our podcast series will discuss difficult topics such as gender-based violence and intimate partner violence, including physical, sexual, emotional, psychological, and financial abuse. Please be aware that this is a thread that is woven throughout all the episodes, and we hope that you will take care of yourselves however you need. Hi, everyone. Welcome to episode 7 of our podcast, You Can't Say That in Court. Today, we're continuing our conversation about family violence and specifically financial abuse and the ways that it can show up in relationships and even after the relationship ends. And so what we have seen and talked about a lot before is about financial abuse in the ways in the relationship. We've shared an example in our prior episodes about a perpetrator of abuse taking the wallet and not giving money or providing an allowance. And these are all things that can happen within a relationship.
Yeah, there are just a whole number of things that are falling under this category of financial abuse, which is why we thought we should devote a whole episode to it, especially highlighting how financial abuse can continue after separation. It feels like a lot of the examples of what truly are financial abuse don't get labeled that way. And so we just want to shine a light on that a little bit, maybe open up the conversation generally for everyone to recognize a little more about that power dynamic that's at play when money is involved. Do we want to dive into some examples first, Vicky, or where do we want to start?
I think it might be helpful to start in asking, how does this happen? Because most people aren't usually financially dependent on someone else, and at some point in the relationship, that happens. And
right.
Let's kind of talk about, how does that happen, or really why does that happen?
Right.
And I think the reality of abusive relationships is the controlling coercive behavior from the perpetrator is to isolate and is to make the other person heavily dependent on the perpetrator. And I think financial independence or financial freedom is one of the ways that a perpetrator can maintain control over the other individual.
Right. Yeah. Would you say it's one of the biggest ways? In thinking about this episode, I've been reflecting on how much financial dependence undermines someone's ability to make decisions in their life and actually do things like leave an abusive relationship or have any kind of power in an abusive relationship. It feels like a really fundamental piece of coercive control.
I do think it's a very big piece. And I do think it's one of the many pieces that heavily intersects with all the other ways of coercive and controlling behavior, especially after the relationship ends. And you've talked about, how to leave a relationship, how to separate. And one of the biggest things that we're currently seeing is the housing market is so expensive, and
Right.
Survivors are not leaving abusive relationships partly because they can't afford it. They don't have the financial ability to afford another home with their children, especially when it's the perpetrator who's controlling the finances.
Right. Well, and it's quite interesting because financial abuse coexists with other types of abuse almost in every case. I've read a couple of studies, and just seeing how often it does come up, that's also another reason we wanted to talk about it today, to really highlight that, because it's Yeah, it's, I think, so fundamental, but it's a really good example of coercive control, especially because financial abusive patterns happen over time more often than they're just like a one-time incident. So, like establishing uh, some kind of paycheck goes directly into an account with only his name on it, for example, or something like that. That's a pattern over time. And so it's a very good example of coercive control. I like using it as that demonstration. But again, it just financial control or financial abuse undermines every aspect of someone's independence. Um, and then, as we're saying, also the ability to leave the relationship. And I find it interesting, even if someone is able to leave an abusive relationship, that financial tie to their abuser doesn't end when they walk out the door, right? That is one of the, I mean, shared children is a big piece as well, but that being tied to someone financially for a long time after the relationship ends is a really big lever for an abusive party to continue their patterns of coercive and controlling behavior. Yeah.
Yeah. If we think about like not just the home that you're living in, the apartment, but also the things that you need to live, like the furniture, your clothing,
Right.
um, and those are the basic necessities that costs money. And
Right.
so, A, you have to find a place to live, and B, can you safely leave with all your possessions? Um, Most likely not, because a lot of survivors do just, grab a go bag with their
Right.
overnight things. They're not going to be able to carry a couch out the door when they leave.
Yeah.
As funny as
Exactly.
that, like we laugh at it and it's
Oh,
really sad, but like
it is.
that's the reality of a lot of people that we know who are in abusive relationships, right? Like we always tell them when we're safety planning to pack a bag with a couple nights of like clothing that you need and like the basic
Right.
necessities.
Yeah.
But it's not safe to take everything. Um,
Right. Absolutely. And I kind of laugh cynically because as soon as I'm picturing someone needing to leave and establish a new household and they need a couch, they also need 75 other things to go with it. And so it's just not possible. Um, yeah, to have everything that you need that costs money to set up when you are leaving, yeah, leaving a relationship like that. It comes back to the reality of if someone is dependent financially on someone else, and oftentimes in an abusive situation, that has been set up on purpose, that dependence has been
mhm.
over time set up, that makes it so much harder to leave. And an abusive person would know that. And that's why they're going to be setting up these dependence relationships. Um, yeah, I
Yeah.
have,
And there's multiple ways that we have seen this dependency being set up, right? Like there's the typical relationship where we call it quote unquote traditional relationship where the survivor may stay at home and care for the house, and the perpetrator, who's the man, takes on the career aspirations, earning the income,
right.
the financial resources for the household. And that's a very typical way where the survivor is dependent financially on the perpetrator because she's not making an income to support herself and the children. It's that is being brought in by the perpetrator.
Yeah, and in that kind of, like you say, quote unquote, traditional structure, there are so many little elements that are examples of economic abuse or financial control that when it's just isolated to the one example, it's not necessarily seen as abuse. It feels like a strong word, maybe generally in society. It feels too strong to label it as abuse. But things like refusing, if the abuser is the primary income earner, and refuses to contribute to household costs, for example, or limits the survivor's ability to work, whether it's the number of hours or what they do for work or taking their paycheck, all those sorts of things. I mean, taking someone's paycheck is a little more obvious, I think, but some of the other pieces, like limiting their hours of work, if they're the lower income earner, it's a very realistic argument to make that I think generally family and friends would say that's really logical to say you should work less so that you can be home and make the food or pick up the kids or whatever it is because you make less money. So why not, why not let me go out and make more money, which is better for the family? And on its face, it seems like a logical reasoning. But when we look at it through a lens of a pattern or coercive and controlling behavior, we can start to put together a picture of someone's, like the survivor's, autonomy and independence being shrunk way down, and that power imbalance being established.
Yeah, some of the more concrete examples that I can think of, it is like, providing an allowance or providing just enough money for the survivor to do what they need to do. So one of the examples that I have heard, which has like shocked me, is that the perpetrator fills up the gas tank and doesn't fill it up to the full, right? And it fills it up just enough for the survivor to do the things that, she needs to do,
Right.
but not more. So like socializing with friends, and there's like that calculation that the survivor needs to do. Is like, okay, if I go into town, especially for like more rural and remote area communities, like if I go into town today to get access to services, then he'll know that I like used up the gas for whatever reason and become suspicious.
Yeah, absolutely. And it goes with similarly for providing an allowance, like for groceries specifically, or for clothing for the kids, and not giving quite enough money for that. I mean, just the fact that an allowance is being established is problematic for sure. But then to further layer it with not providing quite enough so that the survivor has to come back and ask for more and then possibly need to justify all of their purchases. And it just gets really, really complicated and very problematic, and it establishes that power imbalance as well. Yeah, that dictating what can be purchased is a problem, and putting just enough gas in the tank is one of the ways of controlling access to transportation, which in turn, sometimes it's transportation and technology that are needed for work. And so limiting those or controlling those, it can seem like a really small action in the moment, but it just keeps establishing a wider and wider power imbalance. Yeah.
Yeah, we're talking about situations where there's one sole income earner and the other is not. But there are these situations can also happen when both parties are income earners for the families.
Oh, absolutely.
You've talked about the other person taking the entire paycheck, the money is being deposited into their account, and therefore an allowance is being provided.
Right.
And I think it goes back to the autonomy, the freedom, and whether or not that's being controlled, right? So it's not a situation where, both parties are making money and therefore there is no financial abuse. Like we need to dig a little deeper into that and ask, does this person have the ability to use the money the way that they want to? And I've heard examples of like, the money that he makes is for his recreational and fun.
Right.
The money that I make, which I make less than him, is needed for the house. So I need to buy the groceries. I need to spend the money on the children, on their clothing or school supplies and whatnot. That's not considered household stuff. That's like my money, whereas his money isn't contributed to these things. So there's various ways that this can play out as control.
Yeah, and we hear that a lot, that he has complete autonomy in how he spends his money, but leaves it up to the survivor, typically the lower income earner, to try and make ends meet around everything that the kids require or just taking care of the household. Controlling property is another example, like taking away a cell phone that maybe he purchased for her, or if he purchased the family vehicle or a vehicle for her, then he feels like he has the right to take the car keys if he's angry or something like that. And it just, it's really rough because there is that natural power imbalance when one person is making more than the other if they exploit it. Also, they have grounds, in the context of an, an unequal relationship to put assets in their names. Like I can already imagine some of the arguments that someone who's in that more powerful financial position can make that sound really reasonable on their face, but work underneath, under the surface to establish, to just isolate, to further isolate and control someone who has less financial resources. It starts to overlap with other areas, but we were talking about an example that came up in our research from a couple of years ago when we were talking with support workers around the province. And during the pandemic, an example was of an abusive husband who was forced to work from home and just set up all of his technology and his ability to connect at the kitchen table. So he was working in the middle of the kitchen where he could surveil the family, he could just keep an eye on everybody. And then the support worker highlighted that the survivor was struggling because it also used up all the bandwidth, that at that time, I believe this was a pretty rural context as well, but using up the bandwidth so that she didn't have ability to find resources, stay connected to family and friends, whatever it might be. It's a very complicated example for being such a simple situation. It's a pandemic. He has to work from home. No big deal. But then so calculated to really, to show who's in control of the household.
Yeah, and further isolation in that way, right? Because in that situation, she doesn't have the ability to contact people outside the home, so she is more reliant and more dependent on this person who is abusive. So we've spent some time talking about financial abuse in the context of within a relationship prior to separation, but we know that financial abuse doesn't end when the relationship ends. So Stephanie, let's go into what it looks like after separation.
In a court context and just even after separation. And some of the things that we often hear from our clients at Rise are things like he wouldn't pay me spousal support and now he still won't. And then just all of the fallout from that. Anyone who's been anywhere near a spousal support application or a child support application knows how hard it is and how many tries someone has to take to force the higher income earner to pay that spousal or child support. And then leaving the survivor often with no money for a lawyer. And he knows that. And so he can try and wear her down with additional applications or just dragging his feet and knowing how hard that is without having legal expertise in someone's corner.
Yeah. I think the trouble with the current system that we have is that the legal system puts the burden on the recipient, so most oftentimes the survivor, that the burden is on them to force the payment, to apply to court to get the money that they should be owed. And the payor, and in in the scenarios that we're talking about, the perpetrator is the payor, can just oftentimes can just sit back and not do anything unless there is ongoing court or ongoing legal processes that they may need to be involved in. And part of the reason that support issues are so concerning is our family law system requires parties to provide documents about their finances and about their assets, which is a very good thing because that requires, both parties to know what the other party has and hopefully can resolve the issues fairly and, come to an agreement easily. But when you have one person who is not willing to be forthcoming with information or even honest with information, that fair agreement process is now hindered. And the person who is relying on the other individual to provide all the information because they've been isolated from financial information, they don't have it, that requires them to go to court, to make applications, to spend resources on getting the other person to follow the right procedure.
Right. Yeah. And it's so logical from our perspective, talking about what financial abuse might look like in the context of a relationship and then translate that to a court context and go, of course she doesn't know how much money he makes. Of course she doesn't know where their bank accounts are, all that kind of stuff.
Or
We've
how many
seen
bank
that.
accounts.
Or how many bank accounts, exactly, or extra savings, or if the abusive party is self-employed, it gets so much more complicated then. And to then have the onus on the person with less power in the relationship to have that information, it just seems ludicrous. I mean, you laid out beautifully how logical it is from a court's perspective, but from a survivor's perspective, it feels crazy making. I think it's impossible to know what the abusive party's financial situation is if he hasn't divulged it and actively hidden it for years.
Yeah. And I don't want to get into, all the things that the legal system can do, because there are like precautions in place, and there are certain things that, that the court must follow, or the court can do when someone essentially is evading providing proper documents. But again, it's on the survivor to know about those things and to bring it to court, and to say, hi, court, I'm experiencing this, so please make this order to help me out, right?
Right.
When she's trying to leave an abusive relationship, looking after the children, probably either finding or still looking for a permanent safe housing, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, while dealing with this person who is still abusive. Just because the relationship has ended doesn't mean the abuse stops. And navigating this very complex, very complicated legal system.
Yeah, we've had some clients who've said at the beginning of their legal matters that the only way to navigate it is with a law degree, that they feel like they should just go back to school, get a law degree, and then come back and fight in court. And then other clients coming out the other side say they should be awarded a law degree because of everything that they've learned. Because it's just really tricky to know all the options that are available. But yes, there are definitely some legal remedies when an abusive party is not being forthcoming. But I think just going back to the risk of at separation, I think it's really important to note that the financial abuse or control that's happening in the relationship before it breaks down is a bit hidden, but then it becomes a lot more obvious after separation, and it might even escalate. I think it probably often escalates upon separation, because that's one of the only tools left at the disposal of an abusive person, is to exert control financially, like canceling the credit cards, or still having only their name on the bank account, or only the one who knows where the bank accounts are and having access, all that kind of thing. It's not something that an honest, probably like the person in survival mode, is going to think of, like to preemptively cancel something, or to actively draw a bunch of money out of an account before the access gets denied or something like that. But an abusive party will probably be thinking about these measures to further hinder and harm the person who's just left them, and they're trying to get control back, and this is one way that they can try and do it.
And to like the extreme end, like I have heard clients who tell me that the payor even threatened to quit their job so that they don't have money and they don't need to pay like the support, right? Which is financial abuse, but also like psychological and emotional abuse, where the recipient, the survivor, is thinking like, okay, if he loses his job, how am I still able to keep my rent and feed the children?
Yeah, it often occurs to me how, and I mean, I get the question sometimes too, like how do you tell the difference between someone who's in an abusive relationship, or just, oh, they're just weird about finances or something. And I think that's a really valid question, because there are weird societal norms around money. And I think it feels archaic, but I feel like it's still accepted that the person who makes the most money in a relationship can often decide how and where it's going to be spent. And so just having that like broad context or belief that's still around in society, it makes it harder for survivors to explain that what they're experiencing is abuse. I'm sure most survivors can feel that it's abusive. I'm sure they can feel their independence being hindered, and like, that the control is being exerted still. But to explain that to a friend or a family member, it's normal for couples and people in relationships to fight about money. I think there are lots of surveys that say it's the number one reason that people who have commingled finances will fight, is because of money. And so even in a quote unquote healthy relationship, a higher income earner, I think they often can veto others in the family about what they can buy or what's too expensive, or, just making these kinds of decisions. And then the person making less money goes, oh, yeah, that's probably true, and they kind of buy into that power structure as well. I'm sure this is not always the case. I do know that. But I think because that belief system still exists, it's harder to detect when the financial control is abusive.
I think like malicious intent goes along with it, right? And I do want to add, I do want to add like your norm, the norm that you've identified, which is like the financial norm, the person who earns the income usually gets to make the decisions. We can't talk about that without identifying gender norms as well, right?
Yeah,
like we still are in a society where unfortunately there is a gender pay gap, where men are making more money than other people. There is still the expectation that women, are taking longer parental leaves. Like I know of corporate organizations where they don't like it when the fathers take parental leave. So what does that say about who is caring for children in the family, right? So if the father isn't able to, in a heterosexual relationship, and the father is not able to care for the children, then it requires mom to care for a newborn, right? And yes, like in the beginning stages of baby and needing to be fed and all that makes sense. But like we can't speak about one without thinking about these gender norms that are placed on people as well.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I know of examples of dads that I'm friends with who've had backlash from their employers, and that, if a dad's like, oh, I have to leave work early today because my kid has a dentist appointment or something, they're like, oh, and it's not weird for a supervisor or, a boss to say, oh, can't your wife do that? Or, that kind of thing. So that gender norm definitely exists. And I think corporations know they can't question a mom who's going on parental leave, but it's not weird to question a dad who's decided to take parental leave. And that's really unfair for the men who want to do that as well. I mean, that's a whole other thing. But yeah, it's.
I did take us on a tangent. I apologize.
No, I think you're absolutely right. It's just another layer. It's just another layer in the context, right? It's a bunch of things to untangle.
Yeah, but going back to malicious intent.
Yes. I think how do you explain malicious intent to someone? I don't want to derail your thoughts. Sorry, go ahead.
No, but it's because it's not obvious. Like no one, very rarely will have it written down on paper. I am doing this because I want to I want to hurt you, right?
Exactly.
Like that doesn't happen. And I think, as we have identified, that various forms of violence is difficult to prove because it's not as visible, and it's the pattern of coercive and controlling behavior that happens over time. when the legal system is very like incident based, like on this day this happened.
Exactly.
But we do have the courts, recognizing financial abuse in conjunction with other forms of family violence, where we've got this one case where the father cut off all utilities and credit card, including the credit card that the child was using while they were in post-secondary degree. Cutting off the internet and the telephone, delaying financial disclosure, which what we discussed earlier, disobeying court orders, and requiring the survivor to continuously bring court applications to enforce the abuser to do the right thing. And in this scenario, there was no reason to cut off all these utilities or credit cards because he had $1.5 million and there was no debt. So he had the ability to pay. And this was recognized as psychological and financial abuse. So I think everything does need to be taken into context, and looking behind the scenes. Okay, why was this done? Because if someone's like, I had to cut one of 3 credit cards because I just don't have the money to have so much credit card use.
Right.
That makes sense. But
yeah, it's interesting that financial abuse might be an entry point that the courts are a bit more comfortable with when talking about family violence or looking and evaluating family violence. It is definitely an area where there might be more evidence that's, on paper, there's a paper trail, and there are actual receipts and disconnection notices or whatever it might be, and that might be in a survivor's favor. It's also an excellent segue into the next conversation that we're going to have about litigation abuse and how manipulating court systems and processes can just be a further means of coercive controlling behavior or family violence. And it overlaps a lot with financial abuse. So I think that's why we wanted to talk about all of this, the concept of financial abuse first. Even though financial abuse is listed under the definition of family violence, we think that it's probably being addressed more often in courts than it used to be. I think we just need to call it what it is, just really name that this is financial abuse. So we're going to keep talking next time about how this just runs into litigation abuse or court-related abuse. There are a lot of names for it, but it's the same patterns of control that continue into the legal processes. So we'll pick up there when we talk next.
See you next time.
Okay, talk to you soon. Everything that we have said today is not legal advice. If you or someone you know needs legal advice, please consult with a lawyer. We want to acknowledge that this podcast would not be possible without the generous contribution by Women and Gender Equality Canada, Femmes et Égalité des Genres Canada.